Should be live, John.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's live stream. I'm John Lowe. I'm CEO of Big Media, the company that produced the Spy Ops series for Netflix. Thanks, everybody, for watching that series. I'm thankful today to introduce two great Americans. But before that, I want to acknowledge that today's stream is taking place on an important day to me as a New Yorker, someone who was in Manhattan on 9/11, lost some friends on 9/11. It's also an important day to every New Yorker and every DCer and every American. So thankful to be here with two people who've played a role since then in responding to the events of that day. So I want to give a quick shout out to brothers and sisters in the FDNY, particularly to Ronnie and Tommy Geese, Ed Healy, Luke Bernardi, and Pat Gavigan. Also want to recognize two people lost on 9/11, Brian Sweeney and Ronnie Geese Sr., both members of my fire department. And a shout out to all my brothers and sisters at Empire Hose Company 3, many of whom were at Ground Zero with the recovery efforts. And today is also a special day in light of the events that unfolded with the evacuation of Afghanistan. We're going to touch on that a little bit too. But it's very rare that we get direct access to people like Phil and to people like Ben. Let me give you an introduction to them. First, Phil Reilly. What an honor to have you here, Phil. Phil is a 29-year veteran of CIA with prior service in the U.S. Army Special Forces. Phil was a CIA paramilitary officer, served in various positions, including Chief of Ground Branch, Chief of Special Operations Group, which housed CIA's paramilitary ground, air, and maritime assets, and ultimately became chief. He was Chief of Special Activities Division, responsible for CIA's paramilitary and covert influence capabilities. Phil was multiple-time Chief of Station, including Chief of Station Kabul, Deputy Chief of Station Baghdad, and Chief of Station Europe and the Far East. Chief of Operations, CIA Counterterrorist Center, Deputy Assistant Director for Military Affairs. He was Deputy Commander of CIA's Jawbreaker Team. That's what we're talking about today, the very first team and America's first response to the 9/11 attacks. Phil was on that first helicopter that went into Afghanistan. I'm going to get into more detail about that today in just a minute. Next, I'd like to introduce you to another great American, Ben Owen, who's going to be asking most of the questions today. Ben is the owner of Black Rifle, a digital media company, which has nothing to do with coffee, and is the founder of two important nonprofits. First, Flanders Fields, which combats addiction and homelessness in the veteran population, and We Fight Monsters, which combats sex and human trafficking, as well as responding to humanitarian crises globally. Ben just got back. He was part of Task Force Lahaina. He's making a difference everywhere. He's a great American. He's a he's a U.S. Army veteran. He was homeless. He was an alcoholic and was an addicted vet himself. He is still recovering and is leading the way for so many others. He can be seen responding to global events far and wide, and was also intimately involved with the evacuation of Afghanistan. I'm now going to turn the mic over to Ben. Phil and Ben, thanks for being with us today. Take it away, brother Ben.
John, thanks for the introduction. Phil, thanks so much for being here. I'm going to dive right into it, man. That is probably the most ridiculous resume I have ever heard read off. All right. And so the first question I got to ask you is how did that all start? Like, what led you first in the military service and then government service? And I don't want a BS answer. I want like was there some moment in your life that made you realize I've got a call to serve, and you rose your hand and said, send me?
No, good copy. I'll answer that. But to John's point, and the reason we're here today, it is the anniversary, and we want to remember those who gave their lives, not only in the attacks, but the first responders who are still paying the price, and of course all of the servicemen and women who gave their lives in the cause in Afghanistan, and our allies from around the world that supported us in this fight. So God bless them all. And John, thank you, Big Media and Netflix. Not only for this episode about Jawbreaker, but the other, frankly, hidden operations that highlight the work of great Americans, sometimes from many years ago. So it's a lot of stories there, and thank you. Ben, to your question, I was in Georgetown University. And as I graduated, all my friends were going to law school, and some were going to Wall Street. And my dad was on Wall Street, and I probably should have went on that path. But I'd always had a hankering for the military. I said, well, I ought to try it. And again, I'd been a high performer in terms of athletics. So I wanted to do something special at the time. Green Berets, Special Forces was what I wanted to do. And I enlisted. I enlisted in the Army right after graduating Georgetown in 1982. And there was a path available to young people at the time that if you could pass all the wickets of training and get through Special Forces training, you could become a Green Beret, literally directly. And that's, in fact, what I did. Went in and made it through the various stages of it, and became out of the 7th Special Forces Group, which was the Special Forces Group covering Central America, Latin America, which at the time, in the early 80s, was very germane given the nation's conflicts. But that's what happened. I wound up being very lucky. I was on what's called a HALO team, a high-altitude jump team, and I was on what's called a SATM team, a Special Atomic Demolition Munition team. So actually carrying backpack nukes on infiltration, and that was what we were trained to do. But again, a lot of my time was spent in Central America, 7 months or so in Honduras, working those operations.
Did you say you were carrying backpack nukes?
Yeah. SATMs used to be in the U.S. inventory. I was actually the demo guy, so I had some other roles to play, but I did carry it on one occasion. And again, we carried simulators. You don't carry live nukes in training, but their mission was to bring in backpack nukes. There were scuba teams that had the capability as well. So there were various ways to infiltrate, but those were the two primary means at the time.
But Phil, did you do anything exciting or interesting?
Right.
No. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Believe me, I was with very competent people. I was the least qualified young guy, as I explained to you. I had some great people that I was working with. But that ultimately, and I guess the question will come, how to get the CIA, I ultimately spent 3 years in SF. I was about to re-up. I was going to go try for Delta Force. And I got a tap on the shoulder. The CIA had a liaison officer located at Fort Bragg. He'd heard about me or got my name from someone and asked me, was I interested in applying? And so I said yes. And I went through a very rapid onboarding process. Still don't know how rapid as it was, but 1 month after I ETS, which is the term for leaving the military, I was on board in Ground Branch, the paramilitary arm of CIA. So in September of '85, I started with CIA.
So 1981, you're a student at Georgetown, and by 1985, you're with the Ground Branch of CIA.
Roger that.
And you just told that story like it's nothing. Like that's normal.
Well, I got lucky. No, everything fell into place. I had very good mentors. I did my end of it that I needed to do. But it worked out. Again, very, very lucky. You would have said a Georgetown graduate should not enlist in the Army, right? And you'd probably be right. But everything worked out for me. I wouldn't have been a Green Beret. I wouldn't have had the training that I had. I wouldn't have met the guy at Fort Bragg with the CIA. And that started it all. So for me, again, a very lucky sequence of events. I had to do my part. But again, I had great people that I worked with and that I looked up to. Remember, when I went in 82 to the Army, started CIA 85, I mean, we're 10 years after the collapse of Saigon. So the old Mac V. SOG, Green Berets that I worked with then, and some was still with CIA, to me, they were like an ancient history, right? That was 10 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, we're now 22 years from the events we're going to describe in 2001. So I was much closer to Vietnam and those people than I am now to, obviously, the events of 2001.
Okay, so now that I heard that history, I got to ask this. Was Dave Phillips one of your mentors?
Only when I got to CIA.
Okay.
And there's a reason. I was involved with selecting or at least suggesting the right people for the team, and Dave was one of the first people I picked to have a. There's a lot of special forces on that team, as we'll talk about.
So this is 86, 87. You're at Ground Branch. When did Afghanistan first come on your radar? Had you ever heard of it? Did you know what was going on over there? How did that all come to play?
Sure did. I mean, that was what we call Afghan 1, right? The Soviets had invaded in '79. The Soviets were still there. There was a large, very successful covert action program. If you've seen Charlie Wilson's War, you saw the exploits of Mike Vickers and others, obviously, in helping topple the Soviets. I was involved only on the periphery in helping with weapon systems, identification and procurement of weapon systems. Think Stingers, think Milan missiles, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I knew I did not go in at the time, but was very much on the periphery as a young Ground Branch officer for Afghan 1. So the first time I heard of it, and really went on to do other things. Again, Central America was big. The Africa Bush Wars were big. There were a whole bunch of other things that kept me busy in that time period.
Got it. So the Jawbreaker team, you mentioned picking Doc for that, like handpicked him. Did his involvement with village stability operations and that doctrine come into play in that decision?
It did. I'll be honest. I knew he had a great interest in things, CT, counterterrorism. So he was more than the doc, if you will. But he was the medical professional on the team. And mind you, ultimately it was the Office of Medical Services that picked who they sent. And there were many qualified physicians, assistants, and other people. But again, having a special forces background always for me gives somebody an extra leg up. I know they can operate in difficult environments. They've been there. In his case, he did it in a place called Southeast Asia. And I knew he'd do as well as he did. But yes, Doc was a rare total package.
Love it. So the median age of that Jawbreaker team was about 46, right?
I don't know. I was 41, I guess, at the time. But yes, it was not a young team. And CIA often gets told some of their paramilitary or SOF operators, but they tend to be older and skew older than military. They're not a military unit. A lot of times who they're taking from are people who are retiring from the military, who spent 10 or 15 years in the military. So by definition, they're already a bit older. We go for maturity and we go for experience, particularly in an operation like Jawbreaker. You want people that know the terrain. We'll get to Gary Schnell shortly, and Chris and others, who can handle themselves and already have the background. So again, that spoke to having a skewed older. Again, we're not doing the fighting. I'm not in a trench. You can be in certain circumstances, but for the most part, you're advising and helping and facilitating. You're at a strategic level on these teams. Not all the time, as we know, many of our teams really walking and jabbing at this very tactical level. But for the most part, you're there to facilitate at a strategic level.
Okay, so for those people watching who have not seen the Spy Ops episode about Jawbreaker, you're not familiar with Jawbreaker, this is before Task Force Dagger. This is before the horse soldiers. So, Phil, walk us through 9/11, towers go down, and what happens next? When do you learn you're going to Afghanistan and you have to help assemble a team to go in before Special Forces?
No, certainly. I was in language school. I was in Serbo-Croatian, going out to the Balkans to be a chief out there on the events of 9/11. And I just knew immediately, it was Al-Qaeda like everyone else did. And the world was going to be different. The world was going to be different from that day forward. In fact, it was. I, like every colleague that I know, immediately volunteered to get involved with the response. We had no idea what the response was going to be. Gary Schnell, I think by about 2 days after the events of 9/11, was selected to lead a response, a team. Gary being a Dari-speaking case officer with extreme experience in that region, multi-time chief of station, very senior. In fact, he had just hit the mandatory retirement age of 60 years old. He had met Ahmad Shah Massoud, a very critical fact that played out because he gained instant respect having had those bona fides. Again, and he really knew the politics of the region. So he was selected as a team leader. We knew, we collectively CIA, that there was going to be a heavy U.S. military response. It was a paramilitary operation in many respects, and that the deputy should probably be a paramilitary officer. And I luckily was selected to be Gary's deputy. Gary and I had never worked before. I knew of the man. I knew that he was a legendary figure. He had heard my name, and I guess I passed muster. The fact that I was in language school, I was sort of a free agent, you know. Serbo-Croatian wasn't quite as important anymore, but the response was. So I got selected as the deputy. So Gary and I looked around, and we knew it was going to be a very small team. Some of that was logistically driven. The airframe that we had was only going to carry so many people. But we need a medic. We need a communicator. We would need other case officers, other intel collectors. And that's exactly what we took. We went very, very lean, very, very mean. So 7 actually on the team, and then a 3-person air crew, crew chief and 2 pilots. So a total of 10 Americans on that. We left, I say 16th, maybe we actually left CONUS. Maybe the 16th. We started to move forward. Staged in Germany, mustered our gear together and did additional coordination, moved forward from there to Uzbekistan, I believe. And ultimately, on the morning of the 26th, there was a several-day delay. There was some politics involved with our going in, not by the USG side, but some of those former Soviet republics, known as the stands, still had a lot of Russian interference and manipulation. And there was a slow rolling of our ability to get in there. But ultimately, by the morning of the 26th, the 25th in the evening, we were told you can go. So we launched on the 26th September and entered Afghanistan that day during a period of daylight.
Wow. Wow. So 10 of you went into Afghanistan on the 26th of September 2001.
Exactly, yeah, and landed in the Panjshir Valley. The Panjshir Valley, again, for many on the call probably understand the politics of that, but the Northern Alliance was the sole entity, free entity, in the northeast quadrant of Afghanistan. It was led by a wonderful, wonderful person called Ahmad Shah Massoud. I didn't have the honor to meet him. He was assassinated by Al-Qaeda on the 9th of September in what they hoped was like a decapitation strike.
Right.
I could see their logic. I mean, he was such a revered figure, and there was no obvious number two to someone like Ahmad Shah Massoud. But their attempts to sort of break up the Northern Alliance, if you will, by killing Massoud did not work out. What it did was completely galvanize the Northern Alliance to our side. I mean, I should say, obviously, the mission. What was the mission? The mission was to obviously go get the perpetrators of the events of 9/11, but it was also to help the Northern Alliance to neutralize the Taliban, have the Northern Alliance recognize the fact that large numbers of U.S. troops and military power were coming into Afghanistan, to accept that and integrate with us, and then also obviously to prosecute operations against Al-Qaeda. And that's what we did, and that operation, that bringing the Northern Alliance to our side was not a difficult thing. The Northern Alliance were great fighters. They had done very, very well against the Taliban. That's why that quadrant of Afghanistan had never been taken. You know, the lure is that it had never been taken completely by the Soviets either.
Right.
Sadly, it has been taken now by the Taliban. My gut tells me if there's another pushback in the future by the forces of freedom, it'll come probably from the Panjshir.
And it is right now, actually.
It is right now.
So yeah, go ahead, John.
I want to jump into something because there's a part of the story I know about that some of the viewers and listeners may want to know. So, one, is it true you used a Soviet helicopter to go in? Second, what's the reason you used the Soviet helicopter? And while you were doing that, is it true that you were getting waved at by Taliban leadership on the ground?
Yeah, okay. Well, the airframe was an Mi-17, which became ubiquitous for CIA and many others of our operations in Afghanistan. We had it in the region. CIA had a relationship with the Northern Alliance of longstanding. There were several programs going on where we talked to the Northern Alliance. We had not had a team in there for the 6 months prior to 9/11. That helicopter was purchased early on to facilitate those teams going in and out. Again, it hadn't been there for 6 months. It had just recently been refurbished, if you will, elevated a bit. It was a rustic bird. The avionics and such. I mean, CIA won't put people on a non-airworthy bird, full stop. However, I know the avionics and some of the navigation aids were not great. And I say that because the pilot, Ned, had a small Garmin that he kept with him, a small Garmin GPS, and we actually flew by the Garmin GPS. That was how he tracked things.
Now, why did the Taliban guys on the ground wave?
Yeah. Well, when we flew in, again, we went over across something called the Anjuman Pass, about 14,000 feet. That's very high for an airframe. Our bird was heavy. We had an auxiliary fuel tank. We had 10 people and a lot of gear. Again, in addition to weapons and what we would need to survive there and food and such, we had $3 million in cash. And again, we were a heavy airframe, but we made it over the Anjuman Pass. But while we were flying there, we actually flew over a Taliban patrol. And they were right at a central casting Taliban patrol. They looked at and they looked up, and of course there were no markings on the bird. Now the Taliban had a handful of airframes that still flew, and they clearly didn't know what it was and probably assumed it was a friendly. And so they actually waved at us as we flew in.
Well, if any of those Taliban fighters are listening to this now, it wasn't your commanders, and sorry about that. Too bad. Shouldn't have attacked our country. Or given harbor to those who did. But back to you, Ben.
So on the Taliban and obliterating them, you guys did absolutely obliterate them from the outset of Jawbreaker and set the stage for Task Force Dagger to come in to Mazar-e Sharif, Kabul, down to Jalalabad. The early success of what we can call our invasion into Afghanistan after 9/11 is indisputable. What if you had to name what the holdup was that allowed the Taliban to regroup and basically turn us into what ended up being our longest war in history, what would it be?
Well, a lot of reasons, but one that jumps to mind is, they had safe haven largely, their leadership in Pakistan. Parts of the key network, the most virulent and bad parts of the network, the Haqqani network, for instance, were based in Pakistan. So they had a safe haven to operate from. They were a guerrilla movement, so it was very hard to differentiate one Afghan or Taliban from an innocent, from a fighter. I say on the the rapid destruction and the success, if you were, retaking of Kabul and sort of the initial flush of victory in 6 weeks. I mean, it was not CIA played a great role, but again, it was the U.S. military, special operations commands, particularly the special forces, the Green Berets. And I'm not saying that because I was one 1,000 years ago, but the fact is, an ODA, an operational detachment, is actually the perfect tool. The U.S. military picked the perfect tool. You had a small team, everybody cross-trained. Organic to that team was the communications, was the medical, was the engineering, everything they needed, the intelligence, and you couple them. In this case, we couple them in a hybrid way, generally with a small CIA team of 5-6 people. Okay, typically a case officer with linguistic ability for that area, paramilitary officers from CIA who blend in and already had military backgrounds to blend in with the military. You tack on a CCT or a JTAC, somebody who can call in fire accurately, and you have a tremendous lethal package of no more than 20 Americans, 18 to 20 Americans per team. So these teams started with Jawbreaker, and then there was Team Alpha, was the initial one, went in a couple weeks later, dealt with Dostum and Mazar-e Sharif. But we had Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Hotel team, brought in Hamid Karzai on Team Hotel. So it's a very small number of people. The figure I've heard is 300 boots on the ground. 300 people, so it would actually be 600 boots. But boots on the ground. And it's probably accurate. It's a very small number of people. And of course, you can't take credit even just that. I mean, it was U.S. air power that ultimately destroyed the Taliban on the ground. And that on September, late September of 2001, into October, the Taliban were in, entrenched positions, basically surrounding, if you will, the Northern Alliance. So the Taliban were not capable of staying in trenches when U.S. air power was unleashed. So once it started, they buckled very, very quickly.
Got it. So going into a trust-depleted environment like that, where you got an entrenched enemy that is already so effective at identifying the drivers of instability in that population and then exploiting them to control that population, it must have seemed almost an insurmountable task to accomplish the mission with which you guys have been tasked. Can you talk through a little bit, maybe drop us an anecdotal story or two about how that looked early on?
I'll be honest, and this is not just a 2020 vision, and I remember only the positive things, but I really didn't have any doubt that we were going to be victorious in the destruction of the Taliban for the reasons I just mentioned. I mean, while we had a limited number of Americans on the ground, we had a very significant U.S. air power, and we had the big green machine behind us gearing up to come in massive numbers. So I'd never had a concern about the toppling of the Taliban. I also didn't, frankly, have I thought we would get Al-Qaeda. I did not think it would take 10 years or more to get Osama bin Laden, but we can go into all that. But the destruction of Al-Qaeda, effectively making it less powerful, less of a threat, started immediately by destabilizing them, making them run for their lives, making them go undercover, making communications very, very difficult. So all of that was a success story. But again, I did not have doubts about that aspect of it.
So that begs the question. I mean, if you look back to 2001, 2002, Phil, did you have any inkling that we would end up being in that country for 20 years?
No, none whatsoever. Like most people, I guess. If you break it, you buy it. And once we got there, we had a new government in place, and the mission creep started. Were we there creating a new democracy? What was our mission? I knew, and that's an important point. State Department, USAID, DOD, and all of its forms, CIA, all of our allies were there, and everyone had slightly different missions. Now, they were, in theory, were being pulled together in Washington and other capitals, but I sensed at times we weren't all pulling in the same direction. I mean, CIA was there with a CT mission, a force protection mission. JSOC certainly was on that. You know, bigger military had larger roles, stabilizing larger areas and such. State Department may have had a governance component to it. Obviously, USAID obviously trying to bring communities back and giving the people something to work for. But all of that is to say that it became very, very difficult to pull it all together. Again, our specific mission, my specific mission, I went back as the chief of station in Afghanistan 2008, 2009 for 18-month period when there were 100,000 U.S. troops. I had a lot of people. I can't go into numbers, but it was the largest station in the world. It was. It got even bigger after I left. Wow. Bigger than it was in Saigon. And you had every asset and thing you could do. You know, and it was an involved conflict. As I talked about before, you had Pakistan. You had safe haven in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda was in Pakistan. Taliban leadership was in Pakistan. You had the Iranians meddling on the West. You know, Badakhshan, Afghanistan touches China. Pakistan's biggest concern was none of the above. It was India to their east. So India played a big role internally with stability or instability, depending on what side you're on. The other thing was, someone very smart pointed out, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and such, to the north, Kazakhstan, were all nuclear powers. So you think about Afghanistan, with all its issues, and the poor as it is, surrounded at that point, literally, think about it, by nuclear powers, save for Iran, that wants to be a nuclear power. So it's a really difficult place to operate where everyone wants to meddle. Everyone has a dog in the fight or thinks they do. And so Afghans torn in a lot of different directions.
John, you want to grab a question or two from the audience comments here?
Sure. Question about what it was like working with Gary Schnell. And I don't know if the person who wrote that question even knows that Gary passed after conducting his interviews for our series. He later passed. But what was it like working with him? And maybe tell us about your relationship with him and how you're feeling now.
Yeah, no, Gary was a rare person. You know, he's a scholar / warrior. He was a case officer extraordinaire, had gifted linguist. He really knew the politics of the region and the history of the region, which is critical as well. Again, he had met Ahmad Shah Massoud. When we got there, he had a picture of him and Ahmad Shah Massoud that he put in our meeting room, displayed. I said, well, to me, it was a little awkward when I first saw it, until I saw the first Afghans come in the room and see that picture and realize he had instant bona fides with them, because he had met the Commander Massoud, and respected him and did deeply respect him. So Gary was a unique person. And yes, he passed a few months, sadly, after the filming. And if you see the film, please do. He's as eloquent as you'd expect. He had all the politics, and it was dramatic at the time. And again, I'm painting a picture where there was this sort of unison in thought. Well, there was not. I mean, even within CIA, there were disparate ideas about how the war should unfold. Some were maybe a little more favorable towards Pakistan. Some, you know, Pakistan was old evil in some people's minds and such. There were a lot of, I would say, factions. And on the military side as well, how to prosecute the war even. So there were a lot of different voices. And I will tell you, I don't remember an issue where Gary Schroen's opinion either didn't carry the day or ultimately was proven the correct one. So Gary, God bless him.
Rest in peace, Gary. I think there's quite a few questions, and Ben, maybe I'm going to turn it over to you. Maybe we shift gears to the evacuation of Afghanistan and the implications of how that was done, and that ties in with some of the other questions about what do you see for the future of Afghanistan, and maybe a path to hope. You know, what your recommendations might be to the people there, what they can do. I'm consolidating a whole lot of questions about these. The overall question is relating to thoughts on the evacuation and thoughts about the future of Afghanistan.
Sure, I'll talk the evacuation. It is covered in the film. I think when we shot that film, it was an awkward timing because those events were just, you know, occurring and all, and it was still fresh and raw. And I really felt the time. I don't remember telling you, John, what am I talking about first in about when the whole place is collapsing? And that's the story. That's the tragedy. But I'll tell you,
I think we were interviewing you. I think we were interviewing you while that evacuation was going on, and you were definitely. It was obvious that you were aware of what was happening.
Yeah, it was, and like most of my friends, I met one military officer say, "Yeah, that's the way it should have happened." The way no, it was handled very, very poorly. And I'm not going to point fingers at administrations and all, because the prior administration and the current administration both played it wrong, giving the enemy an idea of when we were leaving, telling them we're leaving, and then doing these draconian troop cuts to the point where you had to give up Bagram. There was a whole bunch of things that they did that made it untenable to stay there, to include saying we're leaving completely. So no, I felt very bad about it. I'm as a retired, fairly senior CIA guy who dated with my experience in Afghanistan, it was limited what I could do, but I was getting reach outs from Afghans and from other friends, Americans, trying to help Afghans to get out. And I literally was powerless. There's nothing less helpful from CIA's optic is to have a former senior trying to help get people out. But I will tell you, thankfully, my military colleagues didn't have such reticence or such inhibitions. They did remarkable work. And what unfolded, if there is a good story to be told about the evac, was that people did superhuman things to get people out. I know my old organization did an absolutely tremendous job of maintaining the bonds, an oath you take with an asset to help those people, and we did a very, very good job. Other USG entities, military included, didn't have the mechanisms. They had long since drawn down to a point where it was very, very difficult to get some of those people out. But again, I was on the periphery. I did what I could, but it was virtually nothing compared to the efforts of some great people, probably some people who are monitoring this presentation now. Two shout outs I do want to make. There was an example of this. I was in Qatar, ironically, when a lot of this was going down towards the end, where I met my old friend, General Scott Miller, who was there doing the negotiations with the Taliban. So I got some, not inside baseball, but I certainly had current take on sort of the atmosphere and what things were going. In any event, during the evac, I got a call from a friend in California. Can you find this guy? I heard he landed in Qatar. He's an Afghan. He was former senior. I said, what do I have to go on? I did have a name. I went to the embassy, and I only knew one person, Lieutenant Colonel Belenko in the Defense Attaché shop, Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel. Nice chap. Great chap. I said, this is all I've got. Can you help find this guy? He went to every tent in every camp in Qatar, and he found that guy, and he found the family.
Well done.
There was a special arrangement for them, and they were moved out. So thank you, Colonel Belenko. But what is he? He's a great American is what he is. I had another special forces, and this is common. I know a lot of you know these special forces stories. Guys who had interpreters, and people they were loyal to. I had a guy, he somehow got the handset of some American sergeant on the gate at Hamid Karzai International Airport, on the wall, and somehow coordinated ladder come over the wall at this time, oral bona fides, and they were able to get a family out. I'm like, this guy's an E6 in the Army Reserve. He just exploited and saved some people. So great Americans helping great Afghans. But yeah, very, very sad story.
Yeah, and I know we've got a lot of people watching right now who are part of the evacuation. Agency did an incredible job. You guys got all your folks out. I didn't realize how ill-prepared other government entities were until it was during the non-combatant evacuation operation. I got a call that a large number of family members of Amrullah Saleh were at Blackgate trying to get in and could not. Did you know Amrullah?
Amrullah, yeah, that's. Thanks for bringing that up. Amrullah Saleh was the vice president of Afghanistan at the collapse in September 26th of 2001. He was the interpreter liaison officer for the Jawbreaker Team.
That is insane.
Yeah, he was with the Northern Alliance. He knew the commander Massoud very, very well, loved him. He still teared up in those days when talking about the commander. Again, he was our interpreter liaison. To say he was just an interpreter doesn't do justice. Amrullah Saleh was a genius, probably by anybody's estimate, totally self-educated, unbelievably well-read. And he went all the way up. He ultimately headed the intelligence service, did a number of jobs within the governments, in and out of governments, and ultimately was the vice president when the collapse came. So, yeah, I know Amrullah. I have great respect for him. I know he's got his detractors. As a Tajik, he's viewed as maybe being parochial, but I will tell you something. He was an Afghan patriot.
Yep. Yeah, that's an incredible story to go from being an interpreter on the first helicopter in to being the vice president of the country. That's not lost on any of us. So Ben, you were involved pretty deeply in the evac from Afghanistan. Do you have anything you want to share with the people listening about, what kinds of efforts were done by you and your colleagues, and also how this evacuation, the way it went down, affected many of the people who served in Afghanistan and many of the people who lost friends in Afghanistan? Tell us about your own experience.
Well, I think the way the withdrawal was conducted, let's just call it a retreat. It's what it is, and an abandonment of our allies. It's an ongoing betrayal to anybody that served in the U.S. military, and really anybody that loves this nation, because that's not what we stand for. And like Phil, I don't want to get political and point fingers. It's a multi-administration failure. But what I can say on a positive note is that the collapse and the subsequent Afghan evac, I've seen some of the greatest people I have ever known in my life stand up and realize institutional leadership either cannot or will not do anything right now. We're going to do it ourselves. We saw Americans literally get on airplanes, civilians, and fly to Hamid Karzai International Airport during the collapse to get people out. And a few of them are probably watching this right now. People with literally everything to lose and didn't owe that country a thing went over there to right what they viewed as an injustice they could not sit by idly and watch. And, a good friend and mentor of mine, another Green Beret, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, speaks often about this upswing in human capital. He could say it much more eloquently than I can, but basically grassroots efforts is what's going to redirect the trajectory of our nation. And I think the Afghan evac is unequivocal proof that that's happening. Thousands of Americans who had absolutely no allegiance to Afghanistan or the military, just civilians, not to mention all the veterans that stood up to help get this done, spending their own money, devoting countless hours of time to getting Afghans they've never met to safety. I've seen marriages crumble. We've seen lives lost over the collapse. That sounds doom and gloom, but it is really a very encouraging thing to watch, because you don't see people that don't know each other rally around a cause like that and put so much into it very often. That's a generational thing that happens maybe once in a generation. And I think we may be on an upswing of seeing more of those things happen. And, as far as the GWAT vets, Phil, I'd love your input on this. Today's 9/11. This is a tough day on a lot of Americans, not just vets, but Americans in general. The 800,000 Americans who served in Afghanistan, a lot of them feel like it was for nothing, especially if we look at what's going on right now. It's a safe harbor to 27 different terrorist organizations. A lot of people feel like, what was it for? Do you have a message for them?
I don't know if it's a message, but I'll tell you, a lot of me and probably others, you want to say it's a waste, but it wasn't. Look, we were there because of an attack on our homeland. For the 20 years we were there, there was no attack on our homeland. Okay, and the reason for that was the destruction of Al Qaeda's senior leadership and the ability to come against us. Yes, ISIS is reared its head. There's other factors, but the fact is we have not been attacked. So that's a huge price, a massive price. But the fact of the matter is, we prevented that. Now, is there a safe haven again there? Well, clearly, you just gave the facts. There's a lot of groups there. I'm not quite sure. Attack. You have to have a piece of turf like that to spring from. Let's face it. Most of those flight simulators and such that the 19 terrorists trained on weren't in Afghanistan. But yes, the leadership was there. The leadership was able to base from there. It's tough. Look, at the end of the day, and not to segue here, but if you're bent on self-destruction, you don't have to worry about how you're going to get out of this, where you're going. You're going on a one-way trip. It's very, very hard to stop that.
Agreed completely.
Also very hard to choreograph 19 people willing to kill themselves simultaneously. I say 20, but somebody got cold feet. There were 19 that have ultimately did it. That's tough. Very, very tough. The intel architecture that we built up over there with boots on the ground, human operations, that's obviously degraded significantly because we're not there anymore. Technology will replace some of that. But the fact of the matter is we don't have the eyes and ears that we once had. U.S. government, especially our military colleagues and CIA, got really, really good at tracking and putting someone on the X. That's going to be a lot harder to do now, given the situation.
I think you're absolutely right. And that was even highlighted with that drone strike during the NEO. They zipped a civilian. The over the horizon capabilities are there, but it leaves a lot to be desired. You can't replace human on the ground.
Right.
So, I do feel like a lot of America forgets that the enemy gets a say in when a war is over. If you look at what's going on in Afghanistan right now, we've said the war's over and we left. Is the war over?
Oh, no, clearly not. As we lift and shift and refocus a lot of our resources correctly towards China and other issues, some Ukraine's taking a lot of people's time, as it should. I just hope we don't forget and diminish our CT capability, collective counterterrorism capability, too significantly. Yes, it has to be redirected. Yes, it has to be drawn down to some degree, but keep it as robust and capable as you possibly can. Again, we didn't do it alone. We did it with our allies. We could not have done the successes that we had without our allies, not just the Five Eyes, but throughout the world who rallied to our side. We need to maintain those relationships and not forget our allies now that the war's over. And we need to keep those people in our minds and thank them for that.
You bring up a big point, and I think as a former Green Beret, I'd love your input on this. What we've done to our indigenous and partner nation forces in Afghanistan and historically in Vietnam, both, what sort of an effect is that going to have on the U.S.'s ability to operate in the future?
I would have to think it hurts it. Vietnam was a long time ago when that occurred, and we did bring people out, right? You have the Hmong, you have a whole bunch of Montagnards that were brought out in some numbers. But to your point, yes, we, my career and working with indigenous forces, many of which I can't talk about.
Right.
At some point we leave all those locations, and in some cases they're standing up strong and they've got a chance. In other cases, they're abandoned largely. As a friend wrote recently on LinkedIn, we have a mixed record, as it were. But at the end of the day, we have to salute our national leadership. When that covert action program or the president decides you're now leaving that country, you got to salute and you offer up the best advice that you can. And I will tell you, no American general suggested the course of action that was taken. They all may have agreed and saluted. The president's made a decision, we're leaving. But no one would have suggested the manner with which we did it. They would have preferred a whole host of things we don't have to go into, from the timing to how they were going to do it. But it happened the way it did, and we'll probably pay the price for it. If I was a guerrilla movement, I would take a hard time or look real hard at U.S. support. But it's enticing. If the U.S. is going to support you with weapon systems and what you need, again, as Jonas Savimbi used to say, if you're drowning in quicksand, you'll accept any hand that's extended to you.
That's a good analogy. John, we got any more we can take from the audience? If not, I got one for you.
Not seeing mostly great comments thanking Phil and you, Ben, for your service and for doing what you did at the beginning of the fight. And as we were evacuating, I see a lot of people connected in who are probably connected in from Afghanistan or nearby, who are saying thank you on behalf of the Afghani people. So really nice comments. I wish that we could share more of them with the public.
Okay, good stuff. So I've got a question for you, John, and Phil, I'd like your input on it too. So the Spy Op series you guys are doing in big media with Netflix, you're kind of bringing a light to some of the cloak and dagger stuff that America's been doing over the years, and you're humanizing guys like Phil, which you guys missed it before the call. Phil had to go outside and tell his lawn service people to be quiet. He's a regular guy, just like the rest of us. He's just got a really cool background. How important, as we move forward as a nation and we heal from the moral injury of the collapse of Afghanistan and a million other things that are affecting the mental state of Americans right now, how important is it, John, do you think it is to get content out like this? And I'm not just asking you because you make a living doing it. I mean, I think there's something much bigger at play here for you guys. What are you up to?
Well, I think, especially in recent history, government and its agencies, its failures are the only things we really hear about, right? We hear about a terrorist attack, bad things happening, but what we don't often hear about is the myriad successes of CIA, FBI, U.S. military, and we don't hear about them because they're working, right? There are endless attacks that are being thwarted. We did a series in the past just about that, about attacks that were thwarted at the last minute. That's also on Netflix, called Terrorism Close Calls. But SpyOps seeks to do two things. It seeks to showcase successes of the agency, but also go a little bit deeper into the people behind those stories. So what we like to do is, for all of our documentaries, we like to hear firsthand from the people who were involved in these events. And I think one of the problems that we're having as a country is we're listening to the wrong people. So we're listening to people on social media who are giving us advice about geopolitics, virology, and global events and warfare. And these are just regular people who may have amassed large audiences, but they're not actually qualified to be talking about it. So you have thousands and millions of people getting advice from people who should not be giving advice. And I think that, we're also, as a society, guilty maybe of putting newscasters and commentators up on a pedestal as if they're experts on these global events. So what documentary filmmakers should do is try to bring you directly into the events and hear only firsthand from the people involved. And if you notice, when you watch SpyOps, you'll see 8 episodes. You will not hear a single narrator speaking. So every one of these stories is told from the first person perspective. And that's what we do. We do it real good. If you if you have access to Netflix, check out SpyOps. I think we're lucky. The stories and the missions that Phil and his colleagues have been involved in require no massaging or augmentation by our company or any, because these are the stories that movies and legends are based off of. So that's probably why SpyOps made it to the top 10 in almost every country in the world within a day of being released on the service. I think people are looking to hear authentic stories like this. And all of the credit goes to the people featured in our stories. Big media are just storytellers. But Phil, it was your story. And thanks for letting us tell it in SpyOps. And Ben, thanks for being a great friend to the company, and also for all the great things you do.
Absolutely, brother. And everybody watching, tune in next week at noon. We'll have all the kinks figured out on this restream stuff. We're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann talking about the Taliban Spies episode of SpyOps, which is available now on Netflix. And potentially, we might have
potentially a person to be named later.
Okay. All right.
We for security reasons, we're keeping his
name
until the very last minute.
Okay.
So, but it will not disappoint. But Phil, thank you again. Thanks for on behalf of everyone in New York. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the others. On behalf of the people in New York, thanks for putting a hurting on those people right after 9/11, because we all needed that to happen. You helped us start healing, and you helped the country. So thank you.
No, that's very kind. Listen, if I could just close with, as you reflect upon today, it goes back to the losses, and we talked about that early on. One of the feelings I have, and I suspect a lot of people do, if you were involved in the aftermath and the fight, this country our country, the United States, was so united in those first few years, certainly the first year and a half, 2 years after 9/11. Though it was born out of absolute disaster of 9/11, that feeling of us all being united and one team, one fight was an absolutely magical thing. And so when I look back and the sadness is how that waxed and waned and then ultimately diminished over time to the point where it's long since forgotten. Remember, we had too many people applying for our military. We were turning people away in the few years after 9/11. That's no longer the case. Now we're not making our military enlistment numbers. So again, I'd have to end on that note, but it was a magical time, the goodness that came out of it, and it showed us how great we can be when we're all pulling together. And so hopefully we'll do it again someday, and some of our Afghan allies and brothers and sisters will get the freedom they deserve.
I think that's actually a great note to end on. We should rally around things that unite us and quit focusing on the things that divide us. That's a great place to end.
Agreed.
So on that note, everybody, thank y'all for watching. Phil, thank you so much, man. You're a damn hero, brother. And John, thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Take care.
Good luck, everyone.